Claire Harrison had always loved the holiday season. For her, Christmas was more than just a festive time, it was an opportunity to transform her suburban home into a magical wonderland. Each year, she poured her heart into crafting an elaborate display that not only brought joy to her neighbors but also rekindled her own childhood memories of walking through neighborhoods aglow with lights. This year, however, Claire decided to outdo herself. She had spent weeks meticulously planning her decorations, vintage-inspired wreaths hung on every window, strings of twinkling lights wrapped around the trees in her yard, and an intricate nativity scene taking center stage on her lawn. The piece de resistance was a custom-built Santa's workshop, complete with animatronic elves and a mailbox where children could leave letters to Santa. What made Claire's display unique wasn't just its grandeur, but the fact that it had a purpose beyond mere aesthetics. She had set up a donation booth near the workshop to collect money and supplies for a local shelter. A small sign invited visitors to contribute to make Christmas brighter for those in need. It was a simple gesture, but one that resonated with her community. Neighbors praised her creativity and generosity, and soon her home became the talk of the town. Families drove from nearby neighborhoods just to admire the display, and children squealed with delight as they posed for photos next to the glowing candy canes that lined the walkway. Claire's efforts brought her immense satisfaction, but they also brought attention she hadn't anticipated. A few days after she finished setting up, she noticed an unfamiliar car idling near her house late at night. She dismissed it as a curious passerby, but the next morning, she found one of her inflatable reindeer toppled over, its air hose mysteriously cut. At first, she thought it might have been an accident, perhaps a mischievous child playing too rough, but when she discovered similar damage to the lights around her mailbox the following evening, unease began to creep in. Things took a more troubling turn when Claire found an official-looking envelope tucked into her front door. The letterhead bore the name of her neighborhood's governing association, and inside was a terse notice informing her that her decorations were in violation of community standards. The letter demanded immediate removal of the display and warned that failure to comply would result in a fine of $10,000. Claire reread the letter several times, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Her decorations had always been a highlight of the neighborhood, and she couldn't imagine who would complain about them, let alone to this extent. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Claire reached out to a few neighbors she trusted. To her surprise, most of them hadn't heard about any complaints. In fact, many expressed shock when she showed them the letter. "It doesn't make sense," her next-door neighbor, Martha, said. "Everyone loves your display. It's not like it's causing any problems." Encouraged by their support, Claire decided to contact the association directly. The next morning, she called the office and requested to speak with someone about the notice. After being placed on hold for nearly 20 minutes, she was finally transferred to Janet Winters, the association's chairperson. Janet was known in the neighborhood for her rigid demeanor and strict interpretation of the community rules. Claire had never had any personal issues with her before, but she knew Janet's reputation well enough to be wary. "Ms. Harrison," Janet said in a clipped tone as soon as she picked up the phone. "I assume you're calling about the violation notice." "Yes," Claire replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm confused about why my decorations are being considered a violation. I've been putting up displays for years, and no one has ever said anything before. What exactly is the issue?" "The issue," Janet said sharply, "is that your display is excessive. It disrupts the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood and has generated multiple complaints from residents." Claire frowned. "Complaints? From who?" "Everyone I've spoken to seems to love it." "That's irrelevant," Janet replied curtly. "The association has determined that your decorations violate the standards outlined in the community bylaws. You have 3 days to comply, or you'll face additional fines." Claire's patience was wearing thin. "With all due respect, Janet, I've read the bylaws, and there's nothing in there that prohibits holiday decorations. Could you show me exactly what I'm violating?" Janet hesitated for a moment before replying. "Ms. Harrison, the bylaws give the association discretion to address matters that affect the neighborhood's overall appearance. This is non-negotiable. If you'd like to dispute the fine, you're welcome to file an appeal, but I wouldn't recommend wasting your time." With that, Janet ended the call, leaving Claire fuming. Filing an appeal might not be a waste of time, but arguing with someone as stubborn as Janet certainly seemed to be. Still, Claire wasn't about to back down without a fight. She decided to document her decorations, thoroughly taking photos from multiple angles and gathering statements from neighbors who supported her. If Janet wanted to make this a battle, Claire was determined to come prepared. That evening, as Claire adjusted the lights on her front porch, she noticed a shadowy figure across the street watching her house. The figure lingered for a moment before disappearing into the night. A chill ran down her spine, but she pushed the thought aside. She had bigger things to worry about. The morning after her unsettling call with Janet Winters, Claire Harrison woke up to another letter, this one shoved under her front door, rather than delivered through the mailbox. The envelope was identical to the first official, stiff paper with the neighborhood association's logo stamped across the top. She opened it with trembling hands, already anticipating more bad news. Inside, the letter was even more abrupt than the last, a formal notice that her failure to remove the decorations within the 3-day deadline would result in legal action. There was also a reminder that the $10,000 fine had already been logged in her account with the association, and any additional infractions would compound the penalty. Claire felt her chest tighten as she read the letter. The tone was colder and more threatening, as if written by someone who saw her not as a neighbor but as an adversary to be dealt with. She looked out the window at her display, which stood exactly as she'd left it, beautiful and festive against the gray December sky. How could something that brought so much joy to others suddenly make her feel so exposed and vulnerable? Refusing to let her frustration paralyze her, Claire decided to act. She drove to the association's office, determined to confront Janet Winters in person. The office was located in a nondescript strip mall a few miles from the neighborhood, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a nail salon. Inside, it was as sterile as the outside suggested, with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that hummed faintly overhead. The receptionist barely looked up as Claire approached the counter. "Name," the woman asked, tapping away at her keyboard without breaking eye contact with her screen. "Claire Harrison," Claire said firmly. "I'm here to speak with Janet Winters." The receptionist gave a curt nod and reached for her phone. After a whispered conversation, she hung up and gestured toward a small conference room at the end of the hall. "She'll see you," she said flatly. When Claire entered the room, Janet was already seated at the head of a long table, a stack of files neatly arranged in front of her. She didn't rise to greet Claire but offered a thin, insincere smile. "Ms. Harrison, what an unexpected visit. Please have a seat." Claire sat down, folding her hands in her lap to keep from fidgeting. "I want to discuss these notices," she began. "I don't understand why my decorations are being targeted. They're safe, they're tasteful, and they're no different from what I've done every other year. What's changed?" Janet raised an eyebrow, her expression betraying nothing. "What's changed, Ms. Harrison, is that this year we've received an unusual number of complaints about your property. The board felt it necessary to address those concerns." Complaints. Claire leaned forward, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "From who?" "I've talked to my neighbors, and no one seems to have a problem. In fact, most of them love the display." Janet sighed, as if she were tired of explaining herself. "The association values the privacy of all residents. We're not obligated to disclose the identities of those who file complaints. Suffice it to say, the concerns were credible." Claire clenched her jaw. "I'm sorry, but that's not good enough. You can't just slap me with a $10,000 fine based on vague complaints from people you won't even name. That's not how this works." Janet's expression hardened. "I assure you, Ms. Harrison, we are well within our rights. The bylaws grant the board discretionary authority to enforce community standards as we see fit." She gestured to a binder on the table, flipping it open to a marked page. Section 12.3 explicitly states that any displays deemed disruptive or out of harmony with the neighborhood's character can be addressed at the board's discretion. Claire glanced at the page but didn't bother reading it. "That's incredibly vague," she said. "Who decides what's disruptive?" "You." "The board," Janet corrected, though her tone suggested the distinction was meaningless. "And the board has made its decision. You have until the deadline to comply." Claire felt her hands trembling but forced herself to stay composed. "This isn't over," she said, rising from her chair. "You're making a mistake if you think I'm just going to roll over and accept this." Janet didn't respond, only watching her with that same unreadable expression as Claire walked out of the room. On the drive home, Claire replayed the conversation in her mind, each word fueling her anger. It was clear to her now that this wasn't about complaints or community standards, it was personal. Janet wanted her gone, but why? What could possibly make her decorations so offensive that they warranted this level of hostility? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud honk as a truck swerved past her, nearly clipping her bumper. Shaking off the close call, she realized she needed to focus. Whatever Janet's motives were, Claire needed a plan, and fast. When she got home, she immediately called her friend Martha, one of the few neighbors she trusted. Martha arrived within minutes, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "What's going on?" she asked, stepping inside and glancing at the notice Claire handed her. Martha read it carefully, her frown deepening with each line. "This is insane," she said finally. "I've lived here for 10 years, and I've never seen them go after someone like this." "Do you think Janet's behind it?" Claire asked. "Of course she is," Martha said. "She's always had it out for anyone who doesn't fall in line. But $10,000? That's a whole new level of crazy." Claire nodded, her mind racing. "I need to fight this, but I don't even know where to start. I mean, how do I prove that my decorations aren't a problem?" "You don't have to prove anything," Martha said firmly. "It's on them to justify the fine. And if they can't, they're the ones breaking the rules." Claire felt a surge of hope at Martha's words. She spent the rest of the evening compiling everything she could think of: photos of her decorations, copies of the association's bylaws, and statements from supportive neighbors. She even set up a meeting with a lawyer recommended by Martha, a man named Mark Reynolds who specialized in cases like hers. But as Claire was sorting through her documents, she noticed something strange. The complaint forms attached to the notice included signatures from several neighbors, but some of the signatures didn't match the handwriting she recognized. Suspicion gnawed at her as she pulled out an old Christmas card signed by one of the neighbors listed. The signature on the card was neat and flowing, while the one on the complaint form was jagged and inconsistent. Her stomach dropped. Were the complaints fabricated? Was Janet falsifying evidence to justify her actions? Before she could dwell on it further, a loud crash echoed from outside. Claire rushed to the window and saw one of her reindeer figures lying on its side, its legs twisted unnaturally. The wind hadn't been strong enough to cause that. Someone had done this deliberately. Claire grabbed her phone and stepped outside, the cold biting at her skin. She scanned the yard but saw no one. Whoever had done it was long gone. As she crouched to inspect the damage, she noticed something shiny glinting in the grass, a small metal bolt that didn't belong to the reindeer. Clutching the bolt, she looked up at her darkened street, her unease deepening. This wasn't just about Christmas lights or fines anymore. It was a message. Someone wanted her to feel afraid, and for the first time, Claire realized she might be in over her head. Claire Harrison spent the rest of the night staring at the small metal bolt she'd found in her yard. It was ordinary at first glance, but the circumstances surrounding its appearance made her uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, deliberately sabotaging her decorations as a way of intimidating her. When she finally went to bed, her sleep was restless, plagued by images of shadowy figures lurking outside her windows. The next morning, she called Mark Reynolds, the lawyer Martha had recommended, and explained her situation in detail. Mark listened carefully, asking pointed questions about the notices, the bylaws, and the suspicious complaints. He was calm and professional, but his tone shifted when Claire mentioned the damaged decorations and the bolt. "Claire, this is more serious than just a fine," he said. "If someone is coming onto your property, that's trespassing. Have you reported this to the police?" Claire hesitated. "I thought about it, but I don't know, it feels like such a small thing to bother them with. And I don't have any proof of who did it." Mark was firm. "You should still file a report. Even if they don't investigate immediately, having a record could help later. And I'd suggest installing some cameras if you haven't already." Claire nodded, though the thought of escalating things made her stomach twist. Still, she couldn't ignore Mark's advice. After their call, she spent the morning documenting the damage to her decorations and gathering all the letters and notices from the association. Then she drove to the local police station, the bolt tucked into a small plastic bag in her purse. The officer at the front desk was polite but seemed indifferent as Claire explained her situation. He took her statement and made a note about the bolt but didn't seem particularly optimistic. "It's probably just kids messing around," he said with a shrug. "Still, we'll file this and keep an eye out. Let us know if anything else happens." Claire left the station feeling deflated. It was clear that this was low on their list of priorities, and she couldn't rely on them to take action unless things got worse. She decided to stop by an electronics store on her way home and picked up a set of outdoor security cameras. If no one else was going to take this seriously, she'd have to protect herself. By the time she finished installing the cameras, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over her yard. The decorations looked beautiful in the fading light, but Claire couldn't enjoy them. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of Janet Winters and whoever might be working with her to sabotage Claire's efforts. She wondered if the complaints were even real, or if they were part of a larger scheme to target her specifically. The next day, Mark called with an update. "I've gone through the bylaws and the notices you sent me," he said. "There's definitely something off here. The language they're using is vague, and the fines aren't consistent with what's outlined in their own rules. I think we can argue that they're overstepping their authority." "That's great news," Claire said, relief washing over her. "So what's the next step?" "We'll draft a formal letter challenging the fine and requesting a full list of the complaints they're basing their actions on," Mark replied. "If they can't provide concrete evidence, they don't have much of a case, but be prepared they might double down." Mark's warning proved to be prophetic. That evening, Claire received another letter, this one much more aggressive in tone. It accused her of creating a public nuisance and claimed that her decorations were distracting to drivers and posing a safety hazard. The letter also mentioned additional fines that would be imposed if she didn't remove the display immediately. Claire's hands shook as she read the letter. It was clear that Janet wasn't backing down. If anything, she was escalating the situation. Determined not to be intimidated, Claire forwarded the letter to Mark and then checked the footage from her newly installed cameras. At first, everything seemed normal, just a few neighbors walking their dogs and the occasional car driving by. But then, around 3 a.m., Claire noticed something strange. A dark SUV pulled up across the street and parked with its headlights off. A figure got out, crossed the road, and walked directly toward her yard. The footage wasn't perfectly clear, but Claire could see the person bending down near her decorations. After a few minutes, they walked back to the SUV and drove away. Claire's heart raced as she watched the footage again. Someone had been on her property, and now she had proof. She immediately sent the video to Mark and called the police to update her report. This time, the officer she spoke to seemed more interested, especially when she mentioned the camera footage. "We'll send someone over to take a look," he said. The officer arrived within the hour, a young woman named Officer Bailey who seemed genuinely concerned. She reviewed the footage with Claire and took another statement. "This is definitely trespassing," Bailey said. "And given the circumstances, it could be considered harassment. Do you have any idea who might be behind this?" Claire hesitated, then told her about Janet Winters and the escalating conflict with the association. Bailey listened carefully, taking notes. "It's hard to say for sure without more evidence," Bailey said, "but it's worth looking into. I'll file this with our investigations team and see if we can identify the vehicle." After Bailey left, Claire felt a mix of relief and unease. She was glad the police were finally taking her seriously, but the situation was spiraling into something much bigger than she'd anticipated. She couldn't shake the feeling that Janet, or whoever was working with her, wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The following evening, things took another turn. Claire was inside sorting through more paperwork when she heard a loud noise outside, like something heavy hitting the ground. She rushed to the window and saw that one of her animatronic figures had been knocked over, its motor still whirring uselessly. The figure had been deliberately cut from its base, the wires dangling loosely. Claire ran outside, her phone in hand, ready to call the police again. But as she stepped into the yard, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Lying next to the fallen figure was a printed photo of her house, taken at night. The photo had been torn in half, and on the back, someone had scrawled a single word enough. Claire's hands trembled as she picked up the photo. This wasn't just vandalism, it was a direct threat. Whoever was behind this wanted her to feel afraid, and it was working. She took the photo inside and immediately sent a picture of it to Mark. His response came within minutes. This changes everything. We need to take this to the police right away. And Claire, be careful. This isn't just about fines anymore. As Claire stared at the torn photo, a sense of dread settled over her. What had started as a dispute over holiday decorations had turned into something far more sinister, and she had no idea how far her enemies were willing to go. Claire Harrison sat at her dining table, staring at the torn photo of her house with the word enough scrawled across the back. Her lawyer, Mark Reynolds, had been clear this was no longer a simple conflict with her neighborhood association. This was personal, targeted, and dangerous. Mark had urged her to focus on her safety first, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that backing down now would only embolden whoever was behind these attacks. That morning, Claire went to the police station with Officer Bailey to file yet another report, this time including the threatening photo. Bailey was sympathetic but realistic. "We'll do what we can," she said. "But without a clear suspect, it's hard to take direct action. I'd recommend staying vigilant and letting us know immediately if anything else happens." After leaving the station, Claire drove to Mark's office to discuss their next steps. Mark greeted her with a grim expression and gestured for her to sit down. "I've been digging into the association's finances and records," he began, pulling a stack of papers from his desk. "And what I've found is troubling, to say the least." Claire leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "What do you mean?" "For starters, the complaints against you are highly suspect," Mark said. "I've cross-referenced the signatures with other documents we were able to obtain, and at least 3 of them appear to be forged. But that's not the worst part. The association has been funneling funds into a separate account that doesn't appear in their public financial reports. It's listed as a reserve fund. But the amounts being transferred are far higher than what's typical." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "So they're embezzling money." "It's possible," Mark said, "but it looks more like they're stockpiling cash for something specific. My guess is that they're planning a major project, and they're trying to push you out because your property is in the way." Claire's mind raced. Her house was located on a large corner lot, one of the most spacious in the neighborhood. If someone wanted to redevelop the area, her property would be a key piece of the puzzle. "Do you think Janet Winters is behind this?" she asked. "She's definitely involved," Mark replied. "But I doubt she's acting alone. This kind of operation usually requires multiple players. Contractors, investors, maybe even local officials. They're not just targeting you for fun, Claire. There's money on the line, and that makes them dangerous." Claire took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "So, what do we do?" Mark smiled faintly. "We fight back. I've drafted a formal legal challenge to the fines and the notices, and I'm requesting a full audit of the association's finances. That should put some pressure on them. In the meantime, I think you need to document everything that's happening. The vandalism, the threats, the suspicious activity. Keep a record of all of it. If this goes to court, every piece of evidence will matter." Claire nodded, grateful for Mark's steady guidance. But as she drove home, her determination was tinged with fear. If the association was willing to resort to vandalism and intimidation, what else might they be capable of? That evening, Claire installed additional security cameras around her property, covering every blind spot she could think of. She also reached out to a few trusted neighbors, including Martha, to let them know what was happening. "If you notice anything unusual," Claire told them, "please let me know. And be careful. I don't think these people are playing by the rules." Martha nodded solemnly. "I've heard rumors," she said. "Some of the older residents think Janet is in bed with a big developer. They've been pushing out long-time homeowners for years, but no one's ever had the courage to fight back like you're doing." The next few days passed in a tense blur. Claire kept busy documenting everything, photographing her decorations, saving emails and letters, and keeping a detailed log of every interaction she had with the association. She barely slept, her nerves constantly on edge. The cameras captured little of note: a few cars driving by, the occasional passerby, but the sense of being watched never left her. Then, late one night, her phone buzzed with a notification from one of the cameras. Claire bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding as she opened the app. The feed showed two figures in dark clothing near her front yard, crouching by her decorations. One of them appeared to be holding a tool, while the other scanned the area with a flashlight. Claire didn't hesitate. She called 911 and reported the trespassers, then stayed on the line as she watched the figures on her screen. When they realized they'd been spotted by the cameras, they bolted, disappearing into the shadows before the police could arrive. The officers who responded were courteous but cautious. "We'll file this as another incident," one of them said. "But without clear identification, there's not much more we can do right now." Frustrated but undeterred, Claire shared the footage with Mark the next morning. "This has to be enough to force them to back off," she said. Mark studied the video carefully. "It's definitely compelling," he said. "But I doubt they'll back down so easily. If anything, they'll try to discredit you. That's why we need to stay ahead of them." Later that day, Claire received an email from Janet Winters, summoning her to an emergency meeting with the association's board. The message was terse and vaguely threatening, warning that failure to attend would result in further action. When Claire arrived at the meeting, she was greeted by a room full of stern-faced board members and a smirking Janet. The atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with unspoken animosity. Janet wasted no time launching into a tirade about community standards and the integrity of the neighborhood, pointing to Claire's decorations as a prime example of what she called individualism run amok. Claire stood her ground, calmly refuting each of Janet's claims with evidence. She showed photos of her decorations, highlighted the positive feedback she'd received from neighbors, and even presented her logs documenting the vandalism and threats. But Janet had come prepared as well. She produced a stack of papers, including what she claimed were additional complaints from neighbors. Claire recognized some of the names on the list, names of people who had told her they supported her. "This is ridiculous," Claire said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay composed. "These complaints are fabricated. I've spoken to these people, and they never filed anything against me." Janet's smirk widened. "Are you accusing the board of falsifying documents, Ms. Harrison? That's a serious allegation." "I'm accusing you of abusing your power," Claire shot back. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, one of the other board members cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should adjourn for now and reconvene once we've had time to review all the evidence." Janet looked annoyed but didn't argue. As the meeting broke up, Claire caught the eye of one of the quieter board members, a middle-aged man who had said little throughout the proceedings. To her surprise, he gave her a small nod, as if to say, "Don't give up." As Claire drove home that night, her mind raced with questions. The fight was far from over, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this, and she wasn't going to back down. Whatever Janet Winters and her cronies were planning, Claire was determined to expose them. Claire Harrison woke up the morning after the emergency board meeting with a pounding headache and a growing sense of unease. She replayed the confrontation with Janet Winters in her mind, dissecting every smug look and calculated move. The fabricated complaints, the veiled threats, it was clear that Janet wasn't just trying to fine her for decorations. This was about control, power, and something far bigger than a $10,000 penalty. After brewing a pot of coffee, Claire sat down at her kitchen table and opened her laptop. She had spent weeks documenting every incident, every notice, every suspicious encounter. Now it was time to take it one step further. Following Mark's advice, she started compiling a detailed timeline of events, cross-referencing the dates of the letters she had received with the damage to her decorations and the trespassing incidents caught on camera. As Claire typed, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Mark. The subject line read "Important Update Financial Records." She opened it quickly and scanned the message, her heart sinking as she read. "Claire, I've uncovered additional details about the association's finances. They've funneled nearly $300,000 over the past year into a development fund tied to a private contractor. This contractor specializes in property acquisitions for redevelopment projects. I suspect they're targeting your lot as part of a larger scheme. We need to act fast. Call me when you're free. The pieces were starting to fit together. Claire's property wasn't just a nuisance to Janet and the board, it was a prime target for redevelopment. The corner lot, with its spacious yard and central location in the neighborhood, would be incredibly valuable to anyone looking to expand. Claire felt anger bubbling up inside her. This wasn't about community standards or aesthetics, it was about greed. Before she could call Mark, a knock at the door startled her. Claire peered through the window and saw two uniformed men standing on her porch. They weren't police officers, they wore crisp button-up shirts embroidered with the name of a local inspection company. Cautiously, Claire opened the door. "MS. Harrison," one of the men asked, holding a clipboard. "Yes," she said warily. "We're here to conduct a safety inspection of your property," he said. "We've received reports that your decorations may pose a fire hazard. We'll need to evaluate the electrical wiring and overall setup." Claire crossed her arms. "Who sent you?" "The neighborhood board," he replied smoothly. "This is a standard procedure for reported safety violations." Claire's blood boiled. "I'm sorry, but I didn't request any inspection, and you're not stepping onto my property without a warrant. Have a good day." Before the men could argue, she slammed the door and locked it. Through the window, she watched as they exchanged a glance, scribbled something on the clipboard, and left. It didn't matter what they wrote. Claire wasn't about to let them use bogus safety claims to undermine her case. Minutes later, she called Mark to update him. "They sent inspectors to my house," she said, pacing the kitchen. "They're trying to create a paper trail to make me look like the problem." Mark sighed on the other end of the line. "It's a classic tactic. If they can paint you as a liability, it strengthens their position." "Did they leave anything behind?" "No," Claire said. "I didn't let them in." "Good," Mark said. "But we need to stay ahead of this. I'll draft a formal response denying any safety violations and requesting proof of the complaints they're using to justify these inspections. In the meantime, be careful. If they're escalating this much, they're running out of options, and that makes them desperate." The next few days were eerily quiet. No new letters arrived, and there were no signs of trespassers or inspectors. Claire's neighbors seemed unusually subdued as well. She caught Martha on the sidewalk one morning and asked if she had heard anything. Martha hesitated before answering, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. "Claire, I think they're trying to scare people," she said in a hushed voice. "I got a letter saying I could face fines if I interfere with neighborhood proceedings. They didn't mention you by name, but it was obvious what they meant." Claire felt a pang of guilt. "Martha, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to affect you." "Don't apologize," Martha said firmly. "You're standing up to them, and that's what matters. But be careful. People are afraid to speak up, and I think that's exactly what Janet wants." That night, Claire's cameras captured another unsettling incident. Around 2 a.m., a dark SUV parked across the street, and a man wearing a hooded jacket got out. He walked toward Claire's yard, holding what appeared to be a small canister. When the motion-activated lights turned on, he froze, then hurried back to the vehicle and drove off. The next morning, Claire found scorch marks on the grass near her front walkway. The canister, whatever it had contained, had left a small but visible burn. This was no longer intimidation, it was a direct threat. Claire called the police again, and Officer Bailey arrived within the hour. She surveyed the damage and reviewed the camera footage with a grim expression. "They're escalating," Bailey said. "This isn't just harassment anymore. This is criminal." "Can't you do something?" Claire asked, her voice cracking. "You've seen the footage. You know they're targeting me." Bailey sighed. "We're doing everything we can, Claire. But without a clear ID on the suspect, it's hard to take action. I'll file this as an arson attempt and see if we can link it to anyone on the board." After Bailey left, Claire felt more determined than ever. She called Mark and relayed the latest developments. "We need to hit back hard," she said. Mark agreed. I'm filing a motion for an injunction against the board, he said. If we can prove they're acting in bad faith, we can stop them from imposing fines or taking further action until this is resolved. But we need more evidence. Is there anyone on the board who might be willing to talk? Claire thought of the quiet board member who had nodded at her during the emergency meeting. She didn't know his name, but she remembered his face. Maybe she said, "I'll see what I can do." The following evening, Claire attended another board meeting, this time as an observer. She kept a low profile, watching carefully as Janet dominated the discussion. The quieter board member, whose name she learned was Alan, spoke up only once, questioning the legality of some of the recent fines. Janet quickly shut him down, but Claire saw something in his expression and unease that mirrored her own. After the meeting, Claire approached Alan in the parking lot. "Mr. Smith," she said cautiously. He turned, surprised. "Yes. My name is Claire Harrison," she said. "I think you know what's been happening with my property. I need your help." Alan hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Please," Claire said. "I've seen how Janet treats you. I know you're not on board with what's happening. If you have any information, anything at all, it could make a difference." Alan looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Meet me tomorrow," he said quietly. "At the coffee shop on Main Street. And don't tell anyone we spoke." As Claire drove home, her heart pounded with anticipation. If Alan was willing to talk, she might finally have the leverage she needed to expose Janet and the board. But deep down, she knew she was treading dangerous ground. Janet wasn't going to let this go without a fight, and the closer Claire got to the truth, the more perilous things would become. The next morning, Claire Harrison arrived at the coffee shop on Main Street early, her nerves tightly wound. She chose a corner table where she could see the entrance and sat with her back to the wall. Her coffee sat untouched, cooling in front of her as she watched the minutes tick by. When Alan Smith finally walked in, he hesitated at the door, scanning the room before spotting her. With a cautious glance over his shoulder, he approached and slid into the chair across from her. "I don't have much time," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And you didn't hear any of this from me?" Claire nodded, leaning forward. "I understand. Please just tell me what's going on." Alan hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Janet's been working with the developer Crestline Holdings. They've been buying up properties in the neighborhood through shell companies, targeting anyone who resists with fines, harassment, and intimidation until they either sell or foreclose. He glanced around again, lowering his voice even further. "Your property is the last piece they need for a major redevelopment project. If they can't force you out, the whole deal falls apart." Claire's heart sank. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made her blood run cold. "So all of this, the fines, the vandalism, it's about making me leave." Alan nodded. "It's bigger than you, Claire. Janet has been funneling association funds to cover legal costs and bribes. Anyone who stands up to her gets silenced. I've seen the numbers. They're diverting tens of thousands of dollars into accounts linked to Crestline." Claire clenched her fists, her anger boiling over. Why hasn't anyone stopped her? Surely the other board members. Alan shook his head. The others are either complicit or too afraid to speak out. Janet has connections, and she doesn't hesitate to use them. I tried to push back once, and she made it clear that I'd regret it if I kept asking questions. Claire's mind raced. She needed proof, something solid that could expose Janet and Crestline's scheme. "Do you have any documentation? Anything that shows where the money is going or how they're connected to Crestline?" Alan hesitated again, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. "This is everything I've been able to collect. Bank statements, emails, meeting notes. But be careful if Janet finds out I gave this to you," he trailed off, his fear evident. Claire took the envelope, her fingers trembling. "Thank you, Alan. You're doing the right thing." He stood abruptly, glancing around the coffee shop once more. "Good luck," he said before hurrying out the door. Back at home, Claire spread the documents across her dining table. The evidence was damning: records of transactions between the association and Crestline Holdings, emails detailing plans to pressure resistant homeowners, and even notes from private meetings where Janet discussed strategies to neutralize opposition. Claire immediately sent copies of everything to Mark Reynolds, who called her within minutes. "This is huge," he said, his voice electric with urgency. "This is more than enough to get an injunction against the fines and launch an investigation into the board. I'll file the motion first thing tomorrow, but you need to be prepared. Janet isn't going to take this lying down." That night, Claire was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. She grabbed her phone and rushed downstairs to find her living room window broken, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Outside, her decorations were in chaos, figures toppled, lights ripped down, and wires slashed. Her breath caught when she saw the word "Leave" spray painted in red across her garage door. Shaking, Claire called the police and reported the incident. Officer Bailey arrived within 20 minutes, her expression grim as she surveyed the damage. "This is a clear escalation," Bailey said. "Whoever did this wants to scare you into backing down." "Well, it's not going to work," Claire said, her voice steady despite the fear simmering beneath the surface. The next day, Mark's motion for an injunction was granted. The court ordered the association to cease all actions against Claire until a full review of their practices could be conducted. Mark also provided the documents from Allen to law enforcement, prompting a preliminary investigation into Crestline Holdings and the association's financial dealings. Janet's reaction was swift and aggressive. That evening, Claire received a notice demanding she attend an emergency hearing with the board. When she arrived, the room was packed with residents, many of whom looked confused and uneasy. Janet stood at the front, flanked by her allies on the board, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Ms. Harrison," Janet began, her voice dripping with false politeness. "You've been accused of defamation and disruptive behavior. Your baseless allegations have undermined the integrity of this community, and we're here to address the consequences." Claire stood her ground, meeting Janet's glare with unwavering resolve. "The only one undermining this community is you," she said, her voice clear and steady. She turned to the crowd. "I have proof that Janet and this board have been exploiting all of us for personal gain. They've been using our association fees to fund illegal property acquisitions and line their own pockets." The room erupted into murmurs as Claire handed copies of Allen's documents to several residents. Janet's mask of composure cracked, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "This is slander," Janet snapped. "These so-called proofs are nothing more than fabricated nonsense. You're trying to distract from your own misconduct." Before Claire could respond, one of the residents spoke up. "If it's nonsense, then why not let us see it? Why not let an independent auditor take a look?" The murmurs grew louder, and Janet's confidence visibly faltered. Another resident chimed in, "You've been fining people left and right, Janet. Maybe it's time we asked where all that money's been going." The tide was turning, and Janet knew it. She tried to regain control, but the room was no longer on her side. By the end of the meeting, a vote was called to suspend Janet and her closest allies on the board, pending the investigation. As Claire walked out of the meeting, the cold December air biting at her cheeks, she felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had shifted in her favor. Janet's grip on the community was weakening, and for the first time in weeks, Claire felt like she could see a path to victory. In the days following the explosive board meeting, the neighborhood was abuzz with rumors and speculation. Janet Winters had been suspended from her position, along with two of her closest allies, while an independent audit of the association's finances was underway. The once intimidating figure of authority now seemed diminished, her name whispered with contempt rather than fear. For Claire Harrison, it was a small but significant victory in a battle that had pushed her to her limits. The vandalism on her property had been cleaned up, thanks to the help of neighbors like Martha and a few others who had come forward in solidarity. Together, they repainted her garage door, repaired her decorations, and even added new lights to her display. The simple act of coming together as a community felt like a triumph over the fear and division Janet had tried to sow. Claire spent the next few weeks working closely with Mark Reynolds to ensure that the investigation into Janet and Crestline Holdings didn't lose momentum. The documents Alan had provided proved to be the linchpin of the case, revealing a web of corruption that extended far beyond their neighborhood. The audit uncovered misappropriated funds, forged documents, and a trail of payments leading directly to Crestline. Janet's house, once a symbol of her authority, now stood empty. Rumors circulated that she had left town after receiving notice of impending legal action. For Claire, it was a bittersweet moment. While she felt vindicated, she couldn't ignore the damage Janet had caused both to her personally and to the community. Despite the chaos of the past few months, Claire decided to keep her Christmas decorations up until New Year's Day. Her yard had become a beacon of resilience, drawing visitors from all over the neighborhood. Families who had once been too afraid to speak up now lingered to admire the lights and thank Claire for standing her ground. One evening, as Claire was adjusting a string of lights near the front porch, she noticed Alan Smith walking up her driveway. He looked more relaxed than she'd ever seen him, a faint smile on his face. "I just wanted to say thank you," Alan said, his voice steady. "For everything. If it weren't for you, I don't think any of us would have had the courage to stand up to Janet." Claire shook her head. "I couldn't have done it without your help. Those documents you gave me, they made all the difference." Alan nodded but hesitated before continuing. "I've been thinking about what comes next. The association isn't just Janet, it's all of us. If we want things to change, we need to take responsibility for how it's run. I was hoping you might consider running for a position on the board." Claire blinked, caught off guard. "Me? I don't know if I'm cut out for that. I just wanted to keep my decorations up and be left alone." "That's exactly why you'd be good at it," Alan said. "You care about the people here, not just the rules. We need someone like you to help rebuild trust." Claire didn't answer right away, but the idea stayed with her long after Alan left. She had fought so hard to protect her home and her principles. Maybe it was time to channel that fight into something bigger. By the time the independent investigation concluded, the results were damning. Janet Winters and her associates faced criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud homeowners. Crestline Holdings abandoned their redevelopment plans in the face of mounting legal pressure and public scrutiny. The association, now under interim leadership, announced sweeping reforms to ensure greater transparency and accountability moving forward. On New Year's Eve, Claire stood in her front yard, watching the lights twinkle against the crisp winter night. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, sharing stories, laughter, and cups of hot cocoa. Martha raised a toast to Claire, and the crowd cheered, their voices warm and full of gratitude. As midnight approached, Claire felt a profound sense of peace. She had set out to defend her decorations, but the battle had become so much more than that. It was about standing up to injustice, rebuilding a fractured community, and proving that even in the face of intimidation, one person could make a difference. When the clock struck 12 and fireworks lit up the sky, Claire looked out at the crowd and smiled. The lights in her yard seemed brighter than ever, a symbol of hope and resilience that would carry them all into the new year.